Imagine being so feared, so powerful, that even your corpse made people sick. That even in death, your body continued to dominate the room. This is not fiction. This is how Henry VIII exited the world. But before the rot and horror, there was the legend. Henry VIII didn't start his life as a monster, far from it. Born in 1491, he was once hailed as the embodiment of the Renaissance ideal, a towering figure of intelligence, beauty, and strength. Think of him as a Tudor version of a modern celebrity athlete crossed with a rock star politician. At 17, when he took the throne of England, the world saw him as a shining hope, athletic, educated, charming, an almost divine figure for his time. Imagine a young royal idolized not just by the court, but even by foreign diplomats. But it's precisely this glittering beginning that makes his downfall so tragic. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was like watching a golden statue corrode slowly until it became something grotesque. The tipping point came in 1536 during a jousting match. At 44 years old, Henry was no longer a spry young man, but he still liked to see himself as the heroic knight. That day his horse collapsed mid-charge and crushed him. He was unconscious for 2 hours. That moment, often overlooked by popular retellings, was more than a physical injury. It was the death of the man he used to be. The wound on his leg never healed. It ulcerated and festered for years, not months, years. The infection emitted such a vile odor that courtiers literally passed out, yet none dared complain. That was Henry's power. Your nose could be assaulted, your stomach churned, and you'd still smile in his presence or risk losing your head. But this wasn't just about physical decay. Many historians now believe that this accident may have caused a traumatic brain injury. And when you look at Henry's behavior afterward, the mood swings, the paranoia, the erratic political purges, it adds up. It's not an excuse, but it's context. This was the period he executed Anne Boleyn, his second wife. She wasn't just a queen, she was the woman for whom he broke from the Catholic Church. And then, not long after the accident, he accused her of adultery, incest, and treason, charges historians overwhelmingly agree were fabricated. He had her beheaded. The transformation from golden boy to tyrant was well underway, and so began the reign of the grotesque. The leg ulcer never closed. His weight ballooned. From a trim 89-centimeter waist, he swelled beyond 130 centimeters. He eventually weighed over 180 kilos. The royal tailors struggled to keep up. Worse, he couldn't walk without assistance. A pulley system was built just to lift him from room to room. Doorways had to be widened. This wasn't just a physical limitation. It was a daily reminder to the court that their king, once a demigod of war and song, had become a prisoner of his own body. And then there was the diet. If you think medieval kings ate like gluttons, you're absolutely right. Henry consumed over 5,000 calories a day. Imagine that. Each meal a festival of meat pies, roast boar and beer. Vegetables, almost non-existent. Fiber, forget it. There were no green smoothies in the Tudor court. Combine that with almost no movement, and the result was inevitable. His body began to collapse under its own weight. But the king refused to be seen as weak. So doctors, frightened of angering him, applied the most brutal treatments of the time, cauterization with red-hot irons, poultices made of arsenic, and repeated bloodletting. Instead of healing, they made things worse. The ulcers deepened. Bone showed through the rotting flesh. The man who once commanded armies now couldn't command his own legs. And still, people bowed. They bowed to the stench, to the madness, to the monster he was becoming. Because this was Henry VIII. This was England's king. But behind the curtain, fear ruled the court. Servants and nobles alike whispered behind perfumed handkerchiefs. Everyone sensed something was wrong. Everyone knew the king they served was no longer fully sane. But to say it aloud, treason. This sets the stage for part 2, where we'll dive deeper into Henry's final years, his paranoia, his increasingly disturbing behavior, and the marriages that became more macabre than romantic. Because Henry's story isn't just about a royal death, it's about what happens when unchecked power collides with mortal decay. By the time Henry VIII entered his late 40s, he was no longer just a king. He was a living contradiction. Outwardly, he still commanded obedience, still roared with authority. But inside, the man was decaying, body and mind, layer by layer. The stench of his leg wound was now legendary. Imagine walking through 3 chambers of a palace and still being able to smell your sovereign before he appeared. No perfume could mask it. No servant dared gag. And worst of all, no physician could heal it. Yet the court carried on, or pretended to. By 1540, Henry's paranoia was reaching new heights. It was no longer just about physical discomfort. It was psychological deterioration. He saw betrayal everywhere. Close friends became suspected enemies. Advisors who once shaped the kingdom's future were marched to the chopping block based on nothing more than a look, a rumor, or a dream. And then there were the wives. After executing Anne Boleyn, he married Jane Seymour, who gave him a son but died shortly after childbirth. That tragedy affected him deeply. Jane, some say, was the only wife he truly mourned. But mourning didn't stop Henry from marrying again. In 1540, he briefly wed Anne of Cleves, a political alliance that collapsed in a matter of months. He declared she looked nothing like her portrait, an insult that historians still debate was driven more by his own physical insecurities than her actual appearance. He annulled the marriage and married again, this time to someone very different, Catherine Howard, 19, beautiful, energetic, and everything Henry no longer was. He saw her as his redemption, his last chance at feeling young again. But let's be honest, what Catherine saw when she looked at Henry was a bloated, ulcerated, half-immobile man, nearly 30 years her senior. A man in constant pain, oozing from his legs, breathing heavily and prone to violent rages. Her affair with a young courtier was almost inevitable. And when Henry found out, the consequences were as cruel as you'd expect. Both Catherine and her lover were executed. Her youth, her passion, her betrayal, it all became fuel for Henry's fury. What started as his desperate reach for romance ended as another public display of control. But control in Henry's case was slipping. His next and final wife, Catherine Parr, didn't marry a man. She married a patient. Her role wasn't to love, but to manage, to keep the king functioning. She became part nurse, part guardian, navigating the dangerous tides of his moods and medical emergencies. Imagine the weight of that responsibility, caring for a man whose touch could turn to violence in an instant, whose decisions could ruin entire families on a whim. Behind closed doors, Henry's condition worsened. Most likely he suffered from several chronic illnesses, type 2 diabetes, gout, congestive heart failure, and perhaps even syphilis, though that remains debated. But no diagnosis could fully explain the monster he had become. At court, whispers of his madness intensified. His rages were unpredictable. He would scream for hours, hurling accusations, demanding executions, then silence, long, dreadful silences where he would sit, lost in thought, clutching his leg or staring into space. These were not the actions of a ruler. They were the symptoms of a man unraveling. One haunting anecdote paints the picture well. In the weeks before his death, he ordered the execution of Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, a nobleman from one of the most powerful families in England. His crime? Vague, unprovable accusations of treason, likely nothing more than paranoia. Surrey was beheaded, just 9 days before the king himself died, and yet no one dared say Henry was dying. That too was treason. To speak aloud what everyone saw, to admit that the king was mortal, was to invite death upon yourself. So the charade continued. Physicians performed rituals of healing they knew wouldn't work. Courtiers bowed to a man who could no longer stand. And the monarch, too prideful to admit defeat, denied the inevitable. By the winter of 1546, death was no longer at the door. It was in the room. Henry's legs had gone gangrenous. The infection was so advanced that it darkened the flesh and released the foulest odors imaginable. Fever overtook him, and he fell into repeated fits of delirium. He murmured in his sleep, sometimes names, Jane Seymour, Anne Boleyn. Perhaps guilt finally gnawed through his armor. Perhaps even for Henry, conscience found a way through the fog of madness. But even at this stage, no one dared whisper the word death. So they pretended. They straightened his pillows, dabbed herbs on his wounds, held their breaths and their tongues, until at last he gave the signal. Unable to speak, Henry had his final confessor, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, brought to his side. When asked if he died in the Christian faith, he could no longer answer with words. Instead, he squeezed the Archbishop's hand, a final human gesture, the last flicker of a king, and then it was over. But the indignity wasn't. When Henry VIII finally died in the early hours of January 28, 1547, England didn't just lose a monarch, it inherited a problem, a large, festering, royal problem. Henry's body was a disaster. The ulcers on his legs, the gangrene, the infections, all of it didn't magically end with death. On the contrary, it got worse. Much worse. Death removed the last barrier of dignity. What followed was an ordeal that reads more like a horror novel than a royal chronicle. First, his size. The king was so corpulent that a custom coffin had to be built to accommodate him. But this was not a time of modern embalming. The Tudor method was rudimentary at best, removing internal organs and stuffing the cavity with herbs. That was it. For a man who had become a walking laboratory of disease, it wasn't nearly enough. Within days, the real horror began. His body, laid out in the chapel at Sion Abbey while awaiting the state funeral, began to decompose rapidly. The royal embalmers, however skilled, couldn't stop the inevitable. The coffin swelled, gases built up, fluids leaked, and that's where we reach the most infamous and disturbing scene in this entire story. Late at night, as guards stood silently in the chapel, a puddle began to form beneath the coffin. Something was dripping. It wasn't candle wax, it wasn't spilled wine. It was cadaveric fluid, an oozing cocktail of human decomposition. And then, yes, it gets worse, stray dogs entered the chapel. According to contemporaneous accounts, they lapped up the fluid. It's a moment so horrific, so absurd, that many believed it to be poetic justice. That this king, who had defied the Pope, broken England from the Catholic Church, and executed wives and friends with the stroke of a pen, was now literally being devoured by dogs in a forgotten corner of his own kingdom. Was it true? Some historians think it may have been exaggerated, but the story was recorded by chroniclers of the time, and regardless of exact details, the message stuck. This was no glorious death. This was decay made public. Eventually, on February 16th, nearly 3 weeks after his death, Henry was buried at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, next to Jane Seymour, the only woman he seemed to have truly loved. By then, the stench was so overpowering that attendees had to mask their faces with perfumed cloth. The ceremonies were grand, as befitted a monarch: trumpets, banners, clergy, nobles, all the pageantry of empire. But the contradiction was stark. Above ground, regal pomp. Below ground, rotting flesh and a coffin that had already spilled its secrets. And what of the legacy? Henry's son, Edward VI, the male heir he had moved heaven and earth to produce, would only reign for 6 years, before dying at 15. The great Tudor dynasty that Henry had sacrificed wives and friends to preserve nearly crumbled. Power would pass not through his son, but through his daughters. First Mary, then Elizabeth. And it was Elizabeth, the child of the wife he executed, under false charges, who would become one of England's greatest monarchs. Now let's pause and take stock. What is this story really about? Yes, it's a historical account of one of the most notorious kings in Western history. Yes, it's filled with gore and politics and power struggles. But beneath all that, it's something more ancient, more human. This is a story about decay, about how even the greatest among us are vulnerable to time, disease, and death. Henry VIII built his life on the illusion of permanence, his authority, his image, his dynasty. But in the end, none of it could protect him from the same fate we all face. His body betrayed him. His mind turned on him. His court, once filled with admiration, became a theatre of fear and silent disgust. And when he died, the body he had so richly adorned with royal robes and armor was reduced to something that made people gag. The truth is, Henry's final chapter wasn't just a medical horror show. It was a spiritual reckoning. He could command armies, but not his arteries. He could behead wives, but not outlive his own corruption. He rewrote the laws of England to serve his desires, but couldn't rewrite the laws of biology, and therein lies the tragic poetry. He lived like a god, but he died like a man. And so, in that final contradiction, the king whose image once awed Europe being consumed by dogs and decay, there is a truth we dare not forget. The crown is heavy, but not immortal. And power, no matter how absolute, cannot keep the flesh from rotting. There's something profoundly unsettling about Henry VIII's death. But it's not just the gore, the pus, the gangrene, or the dogs in the chapel. It's what it says about power. Here was a man who reigned as if he were divine. A man who changed the course of a continent, defied popes, rewrote theology, destroyed monasteries, and remade England in his image. He was feared more than loved, obeyed more than admired. His every word reshaped lives, laws, and borders. He believed himself untouchable, and yet in the end he was not spared what waits for every one of us. His final days were not filled with honor, but rot. His throne became a bed, his command a whisper. His body, once the very image of Renaissance, glory became a tomb in motion. It's no accident that historians and writers return again and again to the story of Henry VIII's death. It is more than a moment in English history. It is a parable. Historian Alison Weir wrote that it is one of the great paradoxes of history that a man who began with so much promise ended as a grotesque caricature of himself. That line hits with such sharp accuracy because Henry's tragedy wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, emotional, human. The Golden Prince became a bloated tyrant. The reformer became a destroyer. The lover became the executioner. He began with music, poetry, sport, and vision. He ended in paranoia, silence, and filth. And perhaps that's what fascinates us the most. Because Henry's life is the story of how unchecked power isolates. It distorts. It deceives not just others, but the one who holds it. In his youth, people praised Henry sincerely. As he aged and grew more violent, the praise became forced, the smiles tighter, the rooms colder. Yet the rituals of royalty carried on. No one dared tell him the truth, that he was dying, that he smelled, that he was feared, not adored. So the illusion endured, right up until the very end. And here's where it becomes relevant for us. Now, today. Henry's story isn't just about Tudor England. It's about image, about how people, especially those in power, craft facades, larger-than-life reputations that look immortal from the outside, but are rotting from within. Even today, in our era of polished social media profiles, curated leadership, personas, and the idolization of celebrity culture, the warning rings loud and clear. You can fool the world, but you cannot fool death. Henry tried. He built palaces to immortalize himself. He split the church to have the son he wanted. He executed those who stood in his way. He saw himself as the author of a new age. But that age did not belong to him. It belonged to those who followed. His son died young. His Catholic daughter tried and failed to undo his reforms. And the Protestant daughter of a woman he executed, Elizabeth I, ushered in England's golden age. The ultimate irony? Henry obsessed over having a male heir, even committing atrocities to secure one. Yet it was his daughters, especially the one born of scandal and blood, who gave England its enduring legacy, its poetic justice, the kind of historical symmetry that feels written by fate, and it forces us to ask, what are we remembered for? Our power, or what we do with it? In Henry's case, both are true. He is remembered for breaking from Rome, establishing the Church of England, and reshaping the English monarchy forever. But he is also remembered for the pain, the paranoia, the bloodshed, and the undignified, and the final moments of his life strip away all the royal splendor. There were no trumpets, no divine light, no soaring final words. There was just a swollen body, the smell of death, and a single squeezed hand. And maybe that's the most honest ending any of us can have. Because beyond the myths and crowns and portraits, Henry VIII reminds us of something we often try to forget. We are all mortal. No matter how powerful, wealthy, or admired, we all return to dust. What remains is how we lived, what we built, and who we harmed or helped along the way. That is the true legacy. So when we think of Henry VIII, let us not just gawk at the grotesque details of his death. Let us reflect on the choices that led there. His story is not just a tale of horror, it's a warning, a mirror, and in a strange, twisted way, but a kind of justice.